Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. I am not Peter Miller, who very much regrets that he can't be here. I will do my best to channel him and his welcome, since it's really his vision that makes tonight possible. I am Jeff Collins, a colleague of Peter's, professor of art history and material culture here at Bard Graduate Center. So on Peter's behalf and behalf of our director, Susan Weber, and all my faculty colleagues, I'm really delighted to welcome you to tonight's seminar in Epistemologies of Material Culture. And our guest is Bénédicte Savoy. As some of you know, she's been here for a while as part of our residency program. And perhaps some of you were able to attend the very interesting seminar offered this morning with Richard Tuttle in the study collection, tie-in with the exhibition we have down the street. Let me tell you a little bit about her. Born in Paris in 1972, earned her MA and PhD in German studies at the University of Paris. And from 2009, she's been full professor of modern art history at the Institute of Art Studies and Historical Urban Studies at the Technische Universität in Berlin. I would bore you if I told you all about the prizes she's won, but I can't resist giving you a sense of them. 2011, the Richard Hamann Prize for Art History, awarded by the Philipps Universität in Marburg. 2015, a prize by the Académie de Berlin. In 2016, the Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Prize by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. And I just have to tell you, among my favorites of the research projects for which you have been awarded grants was a 3-year award from 2014 to 17 about dinosaurs as museum objects and popular objects. And this was a project investigating how dinosaur remains have been displayed in museological settings and really deployed as teaching tools. Among the exhibitions that she's curated are 2 exhibitions on Wilhelm and Alexander von Humboldt, one in Paris, and then most recently at the Deutsches Historisches Museum in Berlin in 2019-20. But I think we'll discover that Bénédicte is no stranger to controversy and doesn't shy away from it. And in 2010, curated an exhibition called Napoleon and Europe. And I have to read it to you in German because it sounds better. Traum und Trauma. So dream and trauma. She's currently a member of the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities and the German Academy for Language and Literature. In 2016, was appointed professor of cultural history of artistic heritage in European 18th through 20th century art at the Collège de France in Paris, where she was previously visiting professor. But perhaps most important for the material that she's going to present tonight, since 2018, she's been serving as a consulting expert to the French president, Emmanuel Macron, in a commission to find solutions for the repatriation of African artifacts held in French state museums. And I believe you're doing also a version of that for a German organization, the German Lost Art Foundation. So really on parallel tracks. Tonight, we're going to hear her presentation on Africa's struggle for its art, history of a post-colonial defeat, 1965 to 1985. And that is the subject of a book that she published on that topic with Beck in Munich last year. So let me welcome Bénédicte Savoy to the Bard podium.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Jeff, for your very generous introduction and all the team here for this invitation. I'm delighted to be in New York, and I'm delighted to, or I'm expecting our discussion aftermath. I know what I have to say, but I think the discussion and the confrontation of point of views between Europe in the European debate with you here in the USA is very interesting for me, and I'm very curious about that. As you can see, English is not one of my working languages. I'm a very typical product of the anti-Americanism of France in my childhood. It was the great time of François Mitterrand, when François Mitterrand declared a war against American colonialism, cultural colonialism, and it was not very politically correct for parents to let them their children learn English. So I learned, I had German and Italian, which is great, but I feel a little bit disabled now. And since I've been living in Berlin for 25 years, now my neurons are not so able to speak English very fluently, but I hope you will bear it. So, Africa's struggle for its art, 1965 to 1985. Working on the so-called Savoy report during the year 2018 brought many insights for Felwine Sarr, here on the left-hand side, and for myself. This report, as you know, was a result of a project by Emmanuel Macron when he was a young president, or a very fresh president, almost exactly 5 years ago. He had a very important speech in November 2017 in Ouagadougou, at the University of Ouagadougou, in front of 800 students from this university. And at the end of this very long speech, after 2.5 hours, he said that he wanted to figure out how to organize restitutions. It's a French word, or it's a very important word. We will see why after that it would be very important for him in his 5 years to organize this repatriation. He said, "Je ne peux pas accepter," I have a translation, but I think it's better for me to read it in French first. "Je ne peux pas accepter qu'une large part du patrimoine culturel de plusieurs pays africains soit en France. Il y a des explications historiques à cela, mais il n'y a pas de justification valable, durable et inconditionnelle. Le patrimoine africain ne peut pas être uniquement dans les collections privées et des musées européens. I cannot accept that a large part of the cultural heritage of several African countries is in France. There are historical explanations for this, but there is no valid, sustainable, and unconditional justification. African heritage cannot be only in private collections and European museums." As I said, working on and we had after that 8 months, Felwine Sarr and myself. Felwine Sarr was at that time professor for economics at the University of Gaston Berger in Saint-Louis, Senegal. He's now a professor at Duke University in the USA. And we had 8 months in order to write something practical about restitution. That was the result, Restituer le patrimoine africain. And the undertitle is Towards a New Ethic of Relationship Between Europe and Africa. This working on this report brought many insights for Felwine and for myself. One of them was a physical experience of the absence of African objects in their places of origin, and nearly on the same day, their presence in French museums. You can see here the empty palace of Abomey in today's Republic of Benin. And here you see Felwine and myself, after one night in the airplane, seeing or observing the objects plundered in this location, Abomey in Benin, by the French army in 1892. They were plundered there, and they were at that time in the Musée du Quai Branly, Jacques Chirac, and we had this experience of presence here and absence in 4 hours. It was a very interesting and, for me, existential experience. Another insight was a historical experience, a closer look at the colonial history of African collections in the world. Here you can see the number of African objects in the inventories of public museums worldwide, and the great imbalance between Europe and the rest of the world. A third insight was into how collective memory works. The project took us into a large number of archives in Paris. Once we were there, we were surprised to find that the work we were doing at that time and the restitution debate we were witnessing had actually happened before. to be precise, at the end of the 1970s. You can see here different documents from this period that I found in the archive of the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, but also later in different archives in Germany, for example, in the political archive of the Foreign Office, Auswärtiges Amt in Berlin. And you can see here that the time, it's a huge dossier, and only for the month from January to November 1979, you have piles of documents or folders like that. But also later, and of course in the UK, you can see here some newspaper excerpts from the Londoner Times from 1974, when Ghana tried to claim, or they claimed, the so-called Ashanti regalia. And even in the USA, here's another spectacular example from 1974. Please take a few seconds to look closely at this cover from the African Report published by the New York African American Institute. It shows a baby-size African statue looking for a seat in an empty airplane, and directly above it, in white letters, the hesitant question, will African art ever go home again? All this archive material provided us evidence that the current restitution debate had already taken place 50 years before we, Felwin and I, worked on it, that this debate was genuinely transnational, and that this debate was already very advanced at that time. This earlier restitution debate and its sinking into complete collective oblivion resembles in many ways today's debate on climate change, which also existed already at the end of the 1970s. In this great book of 2019, the New York novelist Nathaniel Rich reconstructs the failure of the steps that were taken at that time. And in the book you mentioned, Jeff, first published in German under the title Afrikas Kampf seine Kunst, Geschichte einer postkolonialen Niederlage, and here in the English version translated by the wonderful Susanne Meyer-Abich, I tried to reconstruct the first and forgotten restitution debate and its failure 30 years ago. In today's presentation, the reason, or one of the most important discovery doing or working on this book was the fact that nearly every conversation today about the restitution of cultural property to Africa already happened 40 years ago. Nearly every relevant film had already been made, and nearly every demand had already been formulated, etc., etc. In today's presentation, I would like to address two things. Firstly, this phenomenon of double amnesia concerning the restitution of cultural property to Africa today. And secondly, the fact that restitutions are not an invention of today's politically correct or woke Europeans, but an issue that was and is very much linked to the Pan-African independence movements and to decolonization in the 1960s and 70s. My presentation today is divided into 3 short chapters. Firstly, Reconnections. Secondly, in word and film. And thirdly, no solidarity or solidarity among professionals. But let me, point 0, start with the phenomenon of oblivion I mentioned before. Amnesia, aphasia. Nowadays, we are not only suffering from colonial amnesia in Europe when we are dealing with the history of African collections in our museums in Paris, London, Berlin, Stockholm, Vienna, etc. We have also forgotten entirely that this debate already took place 50 years ago. Now, it is hard for historians to reconstruct the mechanism of forgetting. Written sources are often absent, and silence and unspoken words are rarely documented. That's why I was very happy to find a short TV statement or document, which I would like to share with you. We go back to the year 1978, to the news program on the French state television channel TF1, Télévision France 1. It was one of two channels, so all the population had to see it, and I'm pretty sure I've seen this video. It featured, this video clip, the anchor Roger Giquel on the subject of restitution. Millions of French people listened in, even children, as I was at that time. Giquel referred to a speech by the Director General of UNESCO in favor of restitution. Then came the following words.
Mais quelle distance, quel fossé entre cette information que je viens de vous donner et l'appel du directeur général de l'UNESCO, M. Mbo, pour que reviennent dans leur pays d'origine les œuvres d'art qu'ils ont perdues dans des circonstances de l'histoire qu'il vaut mieux ne pas trop décrire. Des circonstances de l'histoire qu'il vaut mieux ne pas trop décrire.
What does this sequence from a French news program of 1978 tell us? Firstly, it confirms that the subject of restitution was already widely discussed in public in the so-called mass medias. Secondly, and above all, that there was clearly something hidden behind the spoken words, which could not be voiced quite so easily. Let's listen again. Oops.
Les circonstances de l'histoire qu'il vaut mieux ne pas trop décrire.
Roger Giquel, whose hands usually remain calmly on the table, at that point underlines his phrase with a strange hand movement in the air. His gaze, which is normally directed straight at the camera, is lowered for a moment. Des circonstances de l'histoire qu'il vaut mieux ne pas trop décrire. What we see is, so to speak, historical repression as live action. I was 6 years old at that time. What could children then, the adults of today, understand from this sentence and this gesture? What could children understand of this explicit call for not knowing and not wanting to know? What historical circumstances were at stake? For the adults at that time, for my parents, for my grandparents, for our teachers at school, etc., the message for the neighbors, the message was clear. He referred to the time of colonialism, when France systematically appropriated not only mineral and natural resources, but also cultural objects in the territories it administered. At that time, 1978, this colonial period was present in many French biographies and memories and families. The Algerian War and the war in Indochina were still in everyone's memory. So a short hint was enough. Let's not talk about it, we already know. This was not really colonial amnesia, rather something like aphasia, or as one might say in Germany, Verschwörung des Schweigens, so a conspiracy of silence. I prefer to speak of a family secret. For the adults among us, the brief hint was enough. They knew. For us children, the sentence meant nothing. So we, the adults of today, had to do the memory work by ourselves. That is where we are today. Reconnections. Now, let's go back to the year 1960. In this so-called Year of Africa, 18 former colonies in Africa gained their independence together with membership status at the United Nations. You see here when the flags of these African countries were hosted outside the United Nations headquarters here in New York in September 60. In this December 1960, the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Granting of Independence, also known as the Resolution 1514. With it, the World Organization committed to the right to self-determination for all nations, including and explicitly with regards to culture. Paragraph 3 dealt with possible delaying tactics of the colonial powers, especially with regard to preconditions for independence. You can read it. Inadequacy of political, economic, social, or educational preparedness should never serve as a pretext for delaying independence. This phrase has particular resonance in the current context, where the issue of restitution is often linked to the premise of the building of infrastructure or museums in Africa. Like, if you have no museums, we can't give you this kind of self-determination. In Africa, the first restitution claims were published just a few years after 1960. You can see here the first major article devoted to the issue that I know of. It is entitled Rendez-nous l'art nègre. It was published in Dakar, Senegal, in Bingo, a monthly magazine widely read in Francophone Africa and the African diasporas. Its author was the editor of Bingo, Paulin Joachim. You can see in this, on this editorial. Paulin Joachim was a respected poet and journalist and a typical representative of the Francophone Pan-African movement of the 60s. He was born in the French colony of Dahomey, now République du Bénin, has studied in France, and had made a name for himself in the Pan-African circles of the 50s. In Paris, he appears in an official photograph of the famous Paris Congress of Black artists and writers at the Sorbonne in 1956. Joachim's editorial began with an explicit call to arms. Il est une bataille qu'il nous faudra vaillamment livrer sur tous les fronts de l'Europe et de l'Amérique, la bataille de la récupération de nos œuvres d'art disséminées à travers le monde. He recalls that Europeans have long presented Africans as people without history and without culture. Nous avons longtemps été présentés comme un peuple sans culture ni passé. La récupération légitime de nos arts plastiques pourra bouter le feu à ce mensonge historique. Nous avons besoin de consistance pour le chemin qu'il nous reste à parcourir. He also deconstructs the legitimizing rhetoric of the colonial powers who translocates works of art to Europe. Nous avons pillé pour préserver les productions artistiques du monde noir des vers et des termites. He denounces this rhetoric as lies and excuses. Le bel alibi que voilà, la dialectique brillante que l'Europe a toujours su servir à ses interlocuteurs. Mais personne aujourd'hui en Afrique ne se laisse plus prendre à ce marché de dupes. At this point, I would like to emphasize how much at that time the appropriation of cultural heritage was linked to the idea of shaping the own future. Paulin basically says our culture is something like the power food we need to shape our future as independent countries. We absolutely need it. We need to reconnect to our immaterial culture, philosophies, religions, languages, etc., but also to the material culture. Here, it's important to highlight that such Pan-African ideas were not only present in Africa, on the African continent, but also widely disseminated in Europe in the following decades. Here again is a TV feature from 1984. You see a screenshot of a 3-hour talk show on restitution that takes place on the second German state broadcaster ZDF, Zweites Deutsches Fernsehen. A very interesting setting for such a discussion with 14 experts from museums, from the UNESCO, from the art market, among others. Again, millions of viewers listened in. One of the guests was the ethnologist Tirmiziou Diallo from Guinea. His language was very clear.
Diese Ausbeutung, die war nicht nur materieller Art, die war auch kultureller Art. Durch die nationalen Bewegungen sind wir dazu gekommen, unsere Kultur wieder zu entdecken, der man uns sozusagen bis dahin enthalten hatte, und zwar auf zweierlei Ebene. Einmal auf der theoretischen Ebene und andermal auf der konkreten, indem man uns das weggenommen hat. Und ich denke, man sollte einen Weg finden, in dem, soweit von den Ländern verlangt wird, die Objekte, die für unsere weitere Entwicklung, kulturelle Entwicklung wichtig sind, zurückgegeben werden.
This kind of archive is very, very important, and it's like a jewel because you have the silences. You have this very strange situation after that statement of not knowing what to say, etc. And in order to reconstruct this aphasia or amnesia, it's very precious. Again, here we have the link between restitution and self-determination, and at least by the mid-80s, the European public was very well informed about this issue. Chapter 2, in word and film. We are now familiar with recent films such as Black Panther from 2018, produced by Marvel Studios, or the Nollywood production Invasion 1897 by Lancelot Oduwa Imasuen, which play with the plot of energetically taking back objects from museums to Africa.
Let go! They belong to me! Let go! Let go! The artwork is mine. It belongs to my people.
Benin in 1897.
This kind of very powerful taking back is a very common plot right now. We forget that even such plots were already being made in the 70s. And the idea of violent repossession was already present in many creative minds at that time. I would like to give two examples of this. The first example is a black and white film called You Hide Me, directed by the Ghanaian Nyi Kwate Owu. This 20-minute black and white film was Owu's graduation project at the London Film School, and it is from 1970. The camera accompanies a young black man and woman through the basement of the British Museum and show them unwrapping African objects from boxes and plastic bags. The whole film is accompanied by a voiceover in English with a strong African accent. The commentator, Owu himself, describes the violent provenance of the objects in terms of loot and sack. He speaks of their invisible, quotation, captivity in boxes and plastic bags, and condemns the systematic intended destruction of cultural, religious, and artistic traditions in Africa by colonial administrations. He also speaks of the ideological instrumentalization of African collections in Europe and the United States. The film, you can see Owu himself unpacking an object in the basement of the British Museum, in the storage. The film ends with an urgent appeal. And I can play it.
People. We, the people of Africa and of African descent, demand that our works of art, which embodies our culture, our history, and our civilization should immediately be returned to us.
You Hide Me was a pointed political attack against the presence deemed useless of African cultural goods in the storage of British and other museums. Unseen in the West and inaccessible for Africans, the objects shown in the film appear as an enormous capital hoarded in the basement of the museum, twice buried in the collective unconsciousness of both African and European societies. This film was only a work by a student, but he had a huge career in festivals worldwide and became a kind of pamphlet, cinematographic pamphlet for restitution in artistic form. Another example of artist engagement transports us to Nigeria in the 70s. You can see here the young writer Wole Soyinka from South Africa, who was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1986. In his memoirs, Soyinka reports that in 1977, he recommended to the Nigerian government that instead of negotiating with the British authorities about possible restitution without any prospect of success, it would be better to send a kind of military commando to London. You can see it here. What I proposed instead was that a task force of specialists in such matters, including foreign mercenaries if necessary, be set up to bring back the treasure and as many others as possible in one swift, once for all time, coordinated operation. Whether Wole Soyinka really made this suggestion in the mid-70s can hardly be verified. However, it is clear that the motive he described, a robust grab to bring home African objects from European museums, became a popular narrative in pop and artistic culture up to today. At the famous Pan-African festival Festac 77 in Lagos, Nigeria, the so-called Queen Idia mask, which had been stolen by the British in 1897 and taken to the British Museum, became a symbol of European arrogance. The short video I will share with you shows how this Queen Idia mask is an object of almost 25 centimeters, that big, in ivory from the 16th century. In this video, you will see how this object was present everywhere in Lagos in form of reproductions, very big reproductions, while the British Museum refused to lend the original mask even for a few weeks. And the mask remained until now in London. It's 1 minute, not 26. This Festakt 77 is one of the most important cultural events of all the 20th century. And here this absent object from the British Museum was like a logo for the restitution debate and for as I said, the arrogance of European Museum not being ready to engage with the demands from Africa. Here another object, you have several objects from that time. Here's a cover from a record with this logo. And here the original object in the collection online of the British Museum. Chapter 3, no solidarity amongst professionals. As early as 1979, the important German newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung called restitution a specter in European museums. It was an article from May 1979 with the big begin like that. Seit etwa 6 Jahren geht ein Gespenst in europäischen Museen, kurz Restitution genannt. Gemeint ist damit eine Rückkehr von musealen Objekten in ihre Ursprungsländer, etc., etc. It was, of course, an ironic transformation of Karl Marx's famous sentence about communism in Europe, and other newspaper highlighted the opposition of museums against the demand for transparency and inventories from Africa. For example, here the Times in London, museum opposition to treasure. It was also connected with this restitution debate. We have seen that the restitution debate of the 70s was a concern of the mass media, of intellectuals and artists in both Africa and Europe. One reason why restitution failed at that time had to do with the strong resistance of Western museums and of museums professionals. And I would like to end with this resistance, which is still with us today. You can see here the archaeologist Ekpo Eyo from Nigeria, the leading voice amongst professionals in museums in the struggle for restitution from the late 60s to the 80s. Ekpo Eyo was the first African archaeologist. He did his PhD in Cambridge in the UK and was a very respected scholar. The first official attempts that I could find in European archives to bring back artworks from Africa to Africa is a letter from the German Foreign Office to the Berlin Museums from May 1972, stating, der Direktor des Department of Antiquities im Federal Ministry of Education, Mr. Ekpo Eyo, hat die Botschaft Mithilfe bei der Rückführung einiger im deutschen Besitz befindlicher Bronzestücke gebeten. Ekpo Eyo möchte einige wenige Stücke als permanente Leihgabe nach Nigeria zurückbekommen. You notice they were only talking about a few pieces and about permanent loans, not about the transfer of ownership, for example. This request, or similar requests, also went to other museums in Europe, to Vienna and London, for example, where you can find them in archives. In all these museums, the reactions were negative. And I would now like to conclude by showing you some of the arguments that were formulated in Europe at that time. First example, Stuttgart. You see here Friedrich Kussmaul, director of the Linden Museum in the 70s, with a cigar in the hand, which is very typical. He writes statements like these in official letters to the Ministry of Culture in his region. In Kreisen afrikanischer Intelligenz ist ein manchmal übersteigertes Gefühl eigener Würde, Leistung, Tradition und Zusammengehörigkeit entstanden. It was an answer to a question by the Ministry of Culture in Baden-Württemberg, how to deal with these claims, restitution claims, and the answer was, yes, I will say, I think you understand the answer. Or, wir sollten gemischte Kommissionen aus europäischen und amerikanischen Museumsleuten in Afrika arbeiten lassen, da nur in diesem Fall eine kenntnisreiche, zuverlässige Grundlage zu schaffen sei. The first statement was a clearly racist argument, coupled with the formulation of epistemic and methodological white superiority. So a real negation of the competencies and also the striving for self-determination of African colleagues. Example 2, Berlin. Here you see the president of the Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz, the foundation of cultural heritage, of the Prussian cultural heritage, who is still managing the collections in Berlin, despite the fact that Prussia doesn't more exist since 1945. On the left, and the Generaldirektor der staatlichen Museen zu Berlin, Stefan Wetzold, on the right. Here, between these West Berlin connection, a recurring motif was that the demands from Africa were not cultural, but only political and nationalistic. It's only one example of a lot of examples, but it was, for them, it was clear that it is irresponsible to give into the nationalism of developing countries, and it's particularly ironic if you think about the constellation of the Cold War, when West Berlin was only thinking in terms of nation against Ost Berlin, Berlin East, who was building also, well, East Berlin had the museums, island and all this tradition of museums on that part, and West Berlin was trying to build new museums in order to counter the GDR, and they were the nationalistic one, and they projected their nationalism on, into the African countries. In Germany, museum opposition was effective to organize. Among other things, these professionals, Kussmaul, Wormith, and Wetzold, formulated an internal paper containing several pages of guidelines about how to deal with a restitution claim, or what, how to fight against them, Abwehr. So German word, you know, Abwehr with Wehrmacht, Wehr is fight against, and they wanted to abwehren the restitution claims. I would like just to mention 3 of them. That's a very important paper of 14 pages with all these arguments, or all these ideas how to fight against restitution. You can see on the top, vertraulich. It was, of course, very secret, streng vertraulich, confidential. One of the ideas was to avoid or to ban the word restitution. Da eine Rechtspflicht zu Rückgabe nach den bestehenden Gesetzen nicht vorliegt, muss der Begriff Restitution abgewehrt werden. Sonst entsteht dadurch der Eindruck juristisch unsauberen Erwerbs. Der Begriff Restitution, Rückgabe, muss so weit gefasst werden, dass keine moralische Verpflichtung zu erkennen ist. Dies ist der Ausgangspunkt jeder weiteren Erörterung. In die Diskussion um einen neuen Begriff wurde Transfer eingebracht. Very interesting because, you know, restitution has an historical meaning. It's like you have history, you have time in the word restitution, encapsulated in this word. You have a situation before and then restitution. And in transfer or circulation, you have no history, you have no temporality, you have only room, space. And it's very smart to think, we have to take circulation or transfer instead of restitution, because the normal public wouldn't understand the difference. Okay, yes, let's circulate, but circulate is without all this past and has also no future. Circulation is normal, and okay, and it's very important because at the very beginning of our work with Felwinsar, Emmanuel Macron said in our letter of mission, we had to work on the restitution provisoire ou définitive. It was a formulation by Emmanuel Macron and his team, and the restitution provisoire means provisional restitution or definitive restitution, and provisional restitution are not restitutions, and museums don't need two experts to write 200 pages on restitution, because that kind of loans are very usual for museums. So it was something we had to clarify. A second point, all these points are very interesting, are very interesting historical material. Second point is about emotions, Emotionalität. In the question of return of cultural assets, our museums must expect to come under increasing public, respectively moral pressure. Can read it here. Trotz der für die Bundesrepublik Deutschland eindeutigen Rechtssituation in der Frage der Rückführung von Kulturgütern ist damit zu rechnen, dass ein öffentlicher bzw. moralischer Druck auf unsere Museen zukommen wird. Die Länder der dritten Welt sind entschlossen, ihr Kulturgut wiederzuerlangen und daheim zu präsentieren. Dies ist ein weitgehend emotionaler Vorgang, der nicht gesteuert werden kann, etc. And the consequence of this not being able to control the emotionality of the debate was the position, next point, to say, okay, let's speak only legally about that. And if emotions raise, we have to answer with legality or illegality of acquisitions, but not because if emotions are in the room, we are lost. It's also very interesting because the cultural heritage museums, all these things are connected, religious objects, in sacred objects, objects of the daily life, etc. in museums are connected, are genuinely connected with emotions. So it was an interesting strategy. Another point was about the transparency of inventories. Hier Objektverzeichnisse. Vor der Erstellung solcher Listen wird sowohl von Seiten unserer Völkerkundemuseen als auch der Kulturverwaltung gewarnt. So würden Begehrlichkeiten erst recht geweckt. That's a very German point. In Germany, they ended to publish their collections in the 70s. It's the reason why we have no inventory, no transparency about the collections in the at the Humboldt Forum, the new ethnological museum in the middle, in the heart of Berlin. And it's exactly connected with this decision not to publish the collection from the end of the 70s on. It's interesting because I thought 5 years ago, I thought, okay, the Berlin museums are not able to publish their collections because they had such a trouble with the reunification with East Berlin and West Berlin. It was so difficult, etc. We have to be patient and generous, etc. But the true reason, I was happy to find the true reason. It's not only in Berlin, the case in Berlin, you have the same in Stuttgart, in Hamburg, in München, etc. While France, that is very proud of its colonial past, had no problem to publish the collection. And I think in the UK, it's the same. You have very good online collections from the British museums, but in Germany, it was a very clear strategy at that time. As a reverse conclusion, after reading these kind of documents, these guidelines, we can understand what we must do today. We have to insist on the term restitution, on the historical dimension of our topic. We have to take emotions seriously and demand transparency about holdings. My last example about the reaction of European Museum comes from London, of course. I'll show you a brief excerpt from a TV interview with David Wilson, the director of the British Museum in the 70s, also an outspoken opponent of restitution. And my video is not from the best quality, but I think we can understand David Wilson.
The British Museum in itself is part of world culture. It is a major part of the world culture. If you start to destroy the British Museum by taking things away from it, it's as bad as if you blow up the Parthenon.
By the way, this video is also a document from the 80s, how the mass media, in this case BBC, connected or discussed this topic in the 80s. It's a 1 hour long documentation, very interesting. Conclusion now. My presentation focused on African voices in the 70s at the beginning, but it ended with the voice of white museum directors 40 years ago. Where are we now? When we were working on this report, Felwinsar and I, we had a very interesting conversation with the then Ministry of Culture of the Republic of Benin, Oswald Omeki, and he said, if restitution, he was not, he didn't believe in restitution. He said, okay, we are speaking about an abstraction. It will never come. Sorry. And he said, but if restitution takes place, it will be like the fall of the Berlin Wall or the reunification of both Koreas. What he meant at that time was, okay, I believe not in restitution. I can't imagine restitution in the near future, but if restitution takes place, it will have a huge geopolitical consequences, and I would also say geopolitical consequences. And now we have April 22, we can say a small part of this Berlin Wall has fallen. In November 21, 6 months ago, France decided, together with the Republic of Benin, to transfer the ownership and the objects from the royal objects from Abomey, who has been plundered, well, yes, in 1892. You can see in the very typical way of showing newspapers in Africa and Benin, this this cover of a newspaper, and the important point is, okay, it's a historic moment, but the historic moment is the transfert de propriété des 26 trésors royaux d'Abomey. It's not about these 26 objects from the king of Abomey are coming back. It's not so important, they are coming back, but the historic thing is the transfert de propriété, the transfer of ownership. And it was indeed a very important day. The New York Times referred of that, and also Korean newspapers. It was, or I would say, we had the feeling of having this fall of the Berlin Wall, and to have a before and an after this event. 26 objects sounds a little bit few number of objects if you have in mind that the Musée du Quai Branly holds 19,000 objects from Africa south of the Sahara, and 60,000 of them are from the colonial time. It seems to be not a lot, but there are 26 very important objects, 2.5 tons of historical material, huge monumental royal statues. And these objects were very important in Paris. They were all the time on display in the Musée d'Ethnographie du Trocadéro at the beginning, 130 years ago. After that, in Musée de l'Homme, and now in Musée du Quai Branly, the Ethnological Museum in Paris. And in the Musée du Quai Branly, they had a own rotunda built by the star architect Jean Nouvel. It means it was very important for France, and it's very important for Benin. And it's a reason why it seems to be a little, but it's huge and very important, because it's the first time that former European colonial power gives something back. And it's also the first time that a country south of the Sahara is able to get very important objects back. I can show you the mood, the feeling in Cotonou on this day, on the 10th of November 2021, when the objects came from the airport to the presidential palace of Cotonou. It's a little bit. Main Street between the airport and the Palais Présidentiel. And see posters here with the welcoming the objects. That's Felwin. Daar. And here's the presidential palace. The ceremony of the unpacking the object was very interesting. It was, something like in the iconography of restitution. It was for me like a birth or a rebirth. They took ages, maybe half an hour, to put this huge box with the throne of Béanzin out of this lorry very carefully. And after 5 minutes, it was a rebirth. But the object remained in boxes for 3 months, and they were exhibited only 4 weeks ago, at the end of February, in a very interesting exhibition connecting the old cultural objects from Abomey, these 26 royal objects, with contemporary art. And it's very important because it shows how restitutions are not something about the past, but about the future, about now, the contemporary art, but also about possible fructifications between the old and the future. I show you how the traditional kings of Benin went into the exhibition with the president of Benin, Patrice Talon. You can recognize the representatives of the Republic with their European suits, Patrice Talon, and also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Aurélien Benoncy, and the kings, the traditional kings here. It's a very moving scene. It was amazing to see how these kings in all their majesty were going into this exhibition. as you can see, this exhibition is very clear about the connection between colonization and restitution on the one hand, but also in showing the current art of Benin. Here's I love this picture with two traditional kings and the curator of the modern part of the exhibition showing works by Emo de Medeiros. There are helmets. In Africa, helmets are very omnipresent. Helmets covered by cauris, like little coquillages, shells. And in the helmets, you have iPhones showing thoughts. It's very poetical. And I think that, yes, this connection between the old and the new is crucial to understand how restitution now in the 21st century are important. So I would say the Berlin Wall has fallen now, and we can say at the beginning of our work, what we did, Felwine and I, was something like a mission impossible mission, and now we are a little bit proud to say, yes, mission accomplished, mission accomplie in French, but we should not forget that we could have had this fall of the Berlin Wall 50 years ago, and I would like to end with the end of my TF1 program from 1978, when Roger Giquel, at the end of his program, said,
En tout cas, si on veut préserver les identités culturelles, eh bien, il faut préserver ce patrimoine artistique et donc, quelquefois, le restituer. Il faut bien se plier à ça. Bonne soirée à tous au nom de toute l'équipe du TF1. Dernier journal, Jacques Poux, 23h30.
History is a boomerang. Thank you very much.
Let me just say, for those who are joining us from home, that you can use the Q&A function to send in your questions. They will come to Josh. He will relay them to us. So you can take questions in the room. I could just thank you for a really inspirational lecture and bringing us back to this TV clip. I mean, obviously, the point of your talk was to remind us that these discussions were happening a long time ago and that these ideas were in the air. But I was sitting here thinking that my own first time in Africa was in 1984, so not so long after this, and I went to Dakar in my complete naivete, expecting to see great African objects. So, and of course, there was nothing there. I think there was 10 that you showed on your map. I mean, it was the least represented, and in a sense, I just wanted to share that because you don't have these ideas were widely circulated, but I was reminded that they were not widely circulated enough to penetrate my 20-year-old brain. That was a total shock to me. So
absolutely, these almost complete absence in African cities, like I know the case of West Africa better than the rest, but in Mali, in Bamako, you have this huge culture, Dogon culture, and almost nothing in the Musée National de Bamako. What they have is wonderful, but it's only 8,000 items in inventories, and Paris has much more. In Cameroon is the same, in Benin, etc. And I think this experience, when we have the privilege of mobility, we can go there, but the youth in Dakar, Senegal, in Yaoundé, in Douala, in Chang, in Cameroon, etc., have not the possibility to get a visa because Europe is completely closed. Even for scholars, it's very difficult in our case when we have cooperations with colleagues from Cameroon, for example. I have a very fresh example in mind. We had to struggle with denial of they don't get visa, and that's a scandal, and they don't get visa. And if they have the prices of plane tickets are very high. So it means in these cities where the population, the population is very young. I think, I don't know exactly the statistic, but I think Felwinsar is always reminding that maybe 70% of the population in Senegal is under 25 or something like that. And it's I think it's not sustainable to say, okay, for the 21st century, we want to keep our collections in storages in Paris and London, etc.
Come and see it. Yeah.
And come and see it. It's absolutely, it's cynical. And I hope very much that this hall in the Berlin Wall will bring more and more restitution. And we are on the good way, I think, in Europe. Some countries are.
Lots of questions. Why don't you just choose whoever you wish to?
Okay, I would go from left to right.
Left to right.
From my perspective, please.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating and rich. I have a question about comparative contexts at the time, and whether either from the point of view of claimants in Africa or in Europe, speaking on behalf of Africa, or the museums that were resisting that discourse, was there ever a kind of dipping into comparative claims for return in the same decades, but from other locations, as a kind of either comparative moral claim for return or a kind of comparative resistance to it? And I'm thinking obviously of places like Greece, either national contexts like Greece or Egypt, indigenous contexts, primarily in North America, Jewish contexts in Europe in terms of, Nazi war loot, very different structural, not parallel colonial circumstances. Or was it really a very particular conversation about African colonialism, and whatever else was going on in those other cases with moral, ethical, political claims for return, it was sort of different? How did that
very interesting question about comparison, but also about the different chronologies of claims. And I would say the African case was a collective claim at the United Nations. For example, you have one very important speech by Mobutu Sese Seko in 1973 for all the African nations. It was a Pan-African project. But if you have a look on the alliances in the United Nations, the people who were supporting the African people countries were Greece, Italy, and the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. So it means you had a geopolitics of restitution claims, but also in these collective or alliances, you have different powers. And at the beginning, Greece is not present. The first claim by Greece is from 1982 by Melina Mercouri. She was a film star, but also a very powerful Minister of Culture. And she claimed the so-called Elgin marbles for the first time in 1982. And for me, I think it was the beginning of the disappearing of the African debate, because it was so overwhelming for Europe to have a claim within Europe, that all the newspapers, all these Roger Giquel, TF1, ZDF, etc., they swifted to archaeological question. That's a very interesting thing, I think, with other factors, but it's one of the reasons why the African debate disappeared. Egypt was in the archives I have analyzed, not very present, but Iran. That's also very interesting, because in the 19th century, you had the so-called biblical archaeology. Biblical archaeology is a very European, but also American discipline with a goal of finding the real places from the Old Testament. And these real places were exactly where also the fuel sources were. And you have wonderful maps from the 20s, 30s with biblical archaeology, and you have the city of birth of Nabucodonosor, and 1 millimeter nearby that on this map, fuel,
oil derrick,
source, etc. So I think it's a very interesting question. Another comparison or links were between European museums. They were permanently showing, looking at, in Berlin, they were looking at what is the British Museum doing? And one of the arguments was, the British Museum is not moving, so we shouldn't move in this question. And you had a few alliances between London, Berlin, Paris, etc.
Could I just take the chair's privilege for a moment? Because Aaron's asking about roughly contemporary claims. And I was just wondering, did any of these claims look back to French theory, in a sense, on this? Did they cite Quatre-Mères de Quincy and the letters to Miranda? Because this debate came up in France, against France, by a French person in 1790s. So, I mean, there's all the language they need for moral arguments are available, but were they available and were they used?
No, and you're completely right. It's I was academically born in the Napoleonic era because I wrote my PhD on Napoleon, on French Caesars in Germany, and all these, yes, you are right, Quatre-Mères de Quincy, but also Goethe, Schiller, all the German people.
This is not new, it goes back,
exactly, to Cicero, etc. We have a very important literature on these, and arguments, and very smart arguments, Quatre-Mères de Quincy, but no, they were absent, completely absent, like they are absent now. We could quote Quatre-Mères de Quincy, but nobody does. And it's a reason why it's very important to study the history of such debates.
I'm sorry to interrupt. You had a question here.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Please.
Thank you. Fantastic portrayal of a kind of a lost cultural moment. I had maybe a more focused question on the African colonial restitutions. I wonder, in this network, it's such a rich portrait of France, Germany, Britain, but Brussels, with the unbelievable violence of Leopold's colonialism. And then I was also wondering, Lisbon, Portugal, since the Portuguese are just about the last to decolonize.
Yes, very interesting. I would say I can try to answer from now on. I went to Lisbon 3 weeks ago, and I had my wonderful metaphor about the Berlin Wall is fallen, has fallen, and the colleagues in Lisbon said, "Hey, that's your temporality. We are not so far. We can't, the public era, we can't speak about colonialism. In Portugal, at the moment, it's almost impossible to unpack all these traumas." And my colleague said, "Please let us time. We need maybe 10 years more in order to bring the conversation." And I think Portugal it's maybe like, it's maybe the last, this temporality in these Olympic Games of restitution, what we witness now. You have France, Germany, Belgium is very in the front. Then you have in the second or third position the UK with academic museums, museums of universities, the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford with a very strong and very smart action by Professor Dan Hicks, or other museums, Cambridge, or so University Museum giving back or speaking about this thing. And after that you have, yes, Portugal. But Belgium, Brussels is a very interesting case, because in the 60s, when Congo became Zaire, with the Mobutu Sese Seko as a president and later dictator, he tried to, the the Brexit situation to separate the UK from Europe is a very complicated thing. And when Congo separated from Belgium, when they done this separation, they wrote a very important, a lot of papers in order to fabricate this separation. And Zaire tried to bring the cultural heritage into this paperwork, and it didn't work. Belgium avoided to bring this topic in the discussion, and it's also very interesting. It was 1960, 1963, the London acted the British Museum Act. It was a renouvellement of the British, also 1963 after the independences, and in France we had very similar reactions in order to block all these discussions. Yes, but
this is the act that requires an act of parliament. Is that right, to make a return?
Yes, but the parliament said we are the trustees of the British Museum are responsible, and in this British Museum Act they stated that the British Museum is not allowed to de-actionize collections. Okay, now I think I'm lost in you were, I think, if we remain in we are the next, and then you and you.
Thank you so much for this and for the book as well. I have a question about current debate in Benin regarding the return, because they're returning the objects to a national context, right? But they were taking from, let's say, communal, tribal context, right? They're not going back to the palace in Abomey, they're going to a national museum. And I wonder if between the royal household and the political government, is there debate or even tension that might not get to Western media? Yeah,
that's a very important point, I think. This negotiating the cultural heritage. In this context, in Cotonou, it was very interesting for me to observe how the president of Benin, Patrice Talon, tried to explain how objects with a very clear royal provenience are now, after 129 years of presence in France or absence in Benin, are now something for all Beninese. And that's, you have to work on that. It's not evident. But once more, and you are recalling the Napoleonic period was very interesting, because in this Napoleonic era, you had exactly same or very similar phenomenon. Like when the object came back from France to Belgium, Belgium was a new state, a new country, and you had to, the new king of Belgium had to negotiate with the religious communities, and we had very similar conversations. And for me, maybe the most interesting thing is to accept that these negotiations are part of the cultural heritage. We in France and Germany, we are permanently negotiating with our cultural heritage. A very good example is the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, with these huge debates. Do we want something like that in the middle of our cool city, Berlin, etc.? And we have such discussions now in some African countries. It's the same in Nigeria, with the Oba of Benin and the federal state. And these discussions can only start if the objects are there. You don't have huge negotiations or public debates about an absent cultural heritage. And a few years ago, it was always an argument, against restitution, to say, yes, but if we return some things, we will trigger a civil war in Nigeria or in Cameroon, etc. It was a manner to avoid the discussion. And I think in a lot of countries, they are very used to have these discussions, like in Cameroon, between the very powerful traditional kings and the central state. In Benin, I heard, I always thought that the traditional kings are a little bit weaker than Nigeria or Cameroon, because Benin was a Marxist socialist republic, and this Marxist time was very keen on weaken the traditional kings, of course, etc. But I think, yes, there are discussions, but it's not like a light on off. It will take time. In Berlin, when Napoleon or France gave all the looted objects back, it took 15 years between the return, 1815, and the opening of the first museum, public museum in Berlin, the Altes Museum, 1830. So 15 years are normal. 15 years of discussions about what shall we do with our cultural heritage.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's not really a question, it's just about Belgium and Mobutu Sese Seko. Actually, Mobutu saw some treasures of Tervuren, of the museum in Belgium. He saw that in Minneapolis in the 73, and he asked from the Museum of Tervuren to have some of those objects back, and we sent them back. We sent more than 100 objects back. Some are still there, some have
in
been
1973.
In 1973.
At Mobutu's request.
Yeah.
A little bit later, I think 10 years after 73, the return of 144.
The 73 was the moment he asked for, and then it took some time before it was given back. And some are still there, and they are now exhibited, like a Kuba King, for example. But many have been stolen because there was not a real, I don't know, a real museum. I don't like to speak like that, because for me a museum is also a Western way of having some objects in Africa. But whatever, many have been stolen and then have been sold back in the Belgian market, and some are in private hands and legally bought, because with good faith and all that kind of problems, but some are still there. So there was a tentative, and it's partly succeeded.
Yeah, they gave 144 objects back. You are completely right, at the end of the 70s, but the studies I know about that are saying that these 144 were had been lent for the Exposition Universelle in Brussels shortly before the independence, and they were only on loan in Brussels, and after a lot of negotiations.
That's another story. That's the object of the Musée de la Vie Indigène.
Okay.
So that's another story, but there were really more than hundreds. It's 103 or 7, I can't remember precisely, but that were really given back from the Museum of Tervuren to Kinshasa. At the time, but it was almost owned by Mobutu himself at the time. So it was a little bit tricky, but it was there.
Yes, I think I read a lot about this case, or also in archives, and I think it's not so linearly, it's not so easy. It was a little bit strategic also but okay, we can.
It has, Boris Wastion was curator at the time, under my supervision. He wrote a book about that. It was really Tervuren aller-retour.
Yes, I know that.
But it's a strange story, because it's not a total success, but it was part.
Thank you.
The 26 objects that were returned to Benin were returned by the Republic of France, correct? They were in the collection of the French Republic. And I know that was a very long process, but ultimately an order from the president was decisive. And I'm curious what you think about, in an American context, we don't really have a national collection. The closest we get are public-private partnerships, Smithsonian or the Metropolitan Museum here in New York. I know the Smithsonian recently decided to return a number of objects to Benin, or rather to Nigeria, to the Kingdom of Benin, but that ultimately will be up to a board who are not, necessarily accountable to members of the public. And whether you think there's a specific shift in strategy that in situations like these, people can take to pressurize more private institutions.
Yes, I think we have very different local situation. In France, it was not only a word by Emmanuel Macron. He gave the trigger, but it was the last decision was in the hands of the parliament. We have a law for that, and this law we had only it passed without no voice. All the people said yes, we want to restitute, and it was in the French situation. You have this concept of inalienability. Inalienability means that objects in public collections are like they are like a prison. You can't de-actionize them, and it's a reason why France will need each time a law for that, a special law. And in our work with Fellow Winsar, we proposed, after a lot of discussions with lawyers, that we wish an additional paragraph to the Code du Patrimoine. The Code du Patrimoine is the law for the cultural heritage in France, and we wanted to say, or our recommendation was to say, you have to make an additional paragraph to say objects that are being acquired in the colonial time are not inalienable, and if a country needs it, we should be able to say yes without a new law, etc. Yes, but yes, I think it's very different here, but it's also very different in Germany, where you have federal museums and the Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz from an inexisting country, because Prussia doesn't exist, etc. It's very different from case to case.
In the interest of time, could we have one more question in the room? And then I'd like to share some questions that have come in that I think you'll be interested in answering. So please.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I don't know if my question is relevant or not, but I was interested in the terminology we use, because we used to speak of African work of art, but as you point out, those objects were used for religion purpose and they were objects of worship. And even after restitution, if we display these objects behind window glasses, would it be considered as a way to maintain the colonial gaze in Africa even after restitution? And I was wondering if this issue of display was debated now and before, and yes, that was my question.
It's very interesting. The typology of objects is obviously very different. You have religious objects, a lot of objects of power, dynastic, royal, regalias, etc. You have objects from the daily life, and all of them can have a different future. And we discussed a lot this question of, are museums the only location to have these collections now in African cities, or it is possible to have other forms. It's not completely true that museums are only a European invention. If you read the accounts from explorators from the 19th century, like Stanley, etc., they are describing locations as museums. it's more a location in royal palaces with object, but Stanley said so much, for example, very often, oh, I see the museum of the king's, and it's interesting to have in mind that in African you have other forms of conservation, but also very powerful forms of conservation. Museums are one possibility. Other possibilities could be to re-socialize objects in their communities, religious communities of origin, if they are still existing. But we will see, we have only 26 objects in return, and they are objects of power from Abomey. And at the end, they will display in Abomey. It was your question before. Yes, the museum in 2 years they will return to Abomey, to the original place. Yeah.
That's a great question. Has this permanence? Has it changed the objects? You know, the different objects come back that left. You painted obviously like a narrative of progress, right? With some hope at the end of the story. But Peter Miller just wants to bring it to the present, and he's pointing out. In relation to the sort of willful obscuring of lists and inventories, you know, in Berlin at an earlier stage, he's reminding us that this still happens. And without naming names, he's reminding us of an issue recently here at Bard Graduate Center where a local museum would not let us borrow an object or even publish it in the catalog for fear of provoking a restitution claim. So these are really alive and well. And he wonders, what are museums really for, if that is the attitude. Ivan Gaskell writes in, he says, I have read your recent book. Could you help us to understand why your focus is almost exclusively on Africa? You mentioned Albert Wendt and Samoa, but he asks about those parts of Oceania that remain in French colonial possession. And also if you could tell us something about Patrice Talon. So let me lay that on the table. And then the last question from Suzanne Marchand, she asks, what about objects that were purchased from local dealers, perhaps at bargain prices, or excavated with some form of official permission? Do those pose different legal or moral questions? So I think those will be our last two questions, and then we can discuss more informally next door.
About the...
So Africa, exclusively Africa as opposed to Oceania, and then Talon, and then the question of objects that were not looted per se, but were purchased or excavated with, in collaboration with local authorities.
Why
that have ended up in Europe.
Yeah. Why I focused on Africa has to do with the work with Felwine Sarr. I could say this new book about this post-colonial defeat is like the prehistory of the work we did with Felwine Sarr. And for me, it was a trigger to understand why we were doing exactly the same. It was, you know, it's an existential shock. If you are in archives and you think we are pioneers, Emmanuel Macron is the first president in the world doing something like that, then you find we found a report from 1981 by Pierre Cognam. He was a former director, president of the Louvre, saying exactly the same, what we were saying. And it's not comfortable. It's like a shock for an historian to discover that your work has been done. And for me, it was very important to reconstruct this first African debate. The reason why I didn't focus on Sri Lanka, for example, very important, India with the British Empire, etc., in the 70s. But Africa, the African countries were I think, in my archives, the first and the best documented cases of reclamation. And you have to know in Germany, right now, we have a project with colleagues in Cameroon, and we identify 60,000 objects in inventories in 12 major ethnological museums in Germany. 60,000 objects only from Cameroon, taken away from the Germans until 1919. It's a lot. It's 60,000, and it's also a reason why it's enough to focus on Africa, for example. But I'm aware about the fact that other countries were also struggling for this question about illegally or the legality of acquisitions. I would say it was for a long time. It was very important to decide if something has been taken with or in a legal or illegal form. But in our report, we said that, or not only in our report, in the colonial time, the notion of legality was very imbalanced because colonial rules are not legal. So you can't pick up the legality of the colonial time and to say it's our legality from now. It's like in the Nazi era, it was legal to confiscate collections, but it can't be the legality or our ethical line from today. And if the person who is asking means the illegal excavations after the independencies, I think it's another question. It's a very sensitive question, but it has not to do with this massive extractionism of cultural material, like yes. And the private collections are also something different, I would say, because these national or state organized excavate or expropriation is in our responsibility, because these collections are our collections in Europe. They are state collections, and so we have the responsibility for their future, I would say. A private person or people are another case. And I forgot the third question.
Patrice Talon.
Patrice Talon. Patrice Talon tried to. Patrice Talon has been asking for return since 2016, and the first reaction from France before Emmanuel Macron was niet, no. It was a very cynical answer by Jean-Marc Ayrault, the former foreign minister. He said, "Oh yes, we know how patrimoine important is. We French people have a very high sense of patrimoine, cultural heritage. We can understand your problem, but we have this concept of inalienability, and so we can't say yes. It will remain impossible to return these works." And Patrice Talon decided not to resign, and he decided with his Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Aurélien Agbenancé, and the Ministry of Culture to insist, and it worked. And now he's trying to transform this forgotten cultural heritage into something for all Beninese, a republican symbol, but also, and he's very transparent about that, for touristic purposes, in order to make Benin more attractive. Benin has no riches in the earth and nothing to buy, to sell, and so he tried to fabricate cultural points in this country in order to attract tourists, like in Bilbao, Guggenheim Bilbao, or something like that. And that's what I can say right now. And I can also say that the exhibition in Cotonou, in the presidential palace, it's a temporary exhibition only for a few weeks, is very, very impressive, because of perfectionism, but also because of this connection of old and new. And I was overwhelmed when I was there, and I saw also grandparents answering questions from small children, because the grandparents haven't the answers, it's clear, but they try. And all these questions are raising only because the objects are there. Without objects, you don't ask as a child, and you don't need to give answers as a grandmother, for example.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.